Support comes from the St. Louis Public Library Foundation. During these challenging times, free access to digital resources is a necessity. You can help our community stay connected. Support your St. Louis Public Library at slpl.org.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. With advanced placement exams right around the corner, high school students across the country are preparing for the culmination of their year-long studies of many subjects, and among them are economics and government. Rachel Money is a Parkway West High School teacher who's been preparing her AP students in St. Louis County for those tests by helping them understand how capitalism in particular works, and sometimes does not work, for people in the United States, and how that particular system of economics intersects with government. Her MO, however, isn't focused solely on teaching to the test. It works instead on building media literacy, strategic thinking, and problem solving, and ways to talk through policy differences in a respectful manner. Rachel Money joins us now to talk about that approach. Rachel, welcome.
Hi, thank you.
And here to share perspective from the student side, we also have Parkway West senior Lily Overmann. Lily, welcome to you as well.
Thank you.
So, Rachel, let's start with the basics here. What preconceptions do you find your students coming into your classroom with, particularly as it relates to economic systems and how they work for everyday people?
Yeah, great question. So I would say a lot of students associate the word capitalism with the United States. So when they enter my class, it's kind of the assumption that the United States is capitalistic. In the past, I have taught freshmen, and the freshmen come in and they just, have that word association. They don't always know what it means. They don't always understand impacts that different laissez-faire policies could have. But as we talk through history and understand that, we slowly introduce other systems or other options. And I think sometimes students get their first exposure in high school classes to other ideas, and it just becomes an opportunity for them to learn, to explore new ideas, and then to come to their own opinions later on.
Mm-hmm. How do you go about defining capitalism first?
So largely, we'll talk about, more of a free market. We will talk about differences in how governments throughout history have approached capitalism. So we'll talk about laissez-faire, very hands-off policy. We'll talk about private ownership. And, it's kind of those basic definitions that students need to understand the idea of capitalism as well as capitalism throughout history.
Mm-hmm. And then socialism. How do you present that and how do you define it as you're talking with students, maybe starting with that freshman year level and then maybe when they're a little bit older?
Yeah, so when other economic systems come up in the freshman level class that I used to teach, it was largely talking about times throughout history when countries, specifically I'm thinking of the Russian Revolution, is kind of the first moment that we've introduced other economic systems. Because in our course, up until that point, anytime we talked about economic systems had been the United States and U.S. historic policy. So we talk about differences being, private ownership compared to the government making more of those decisions, redistribution of wealth. And with that, to kind of emphasize capitalism to socialism to even things like communism, we've played a game with actually bubble gum where we distribute bubble gum pieces and they can play rock, paper, scissors to compete to get more pieces of bubble gum. And in that game, competing to get additional pieces of the gum, they're, learning about capitalism and seeing that kind of showing how each student is responsible for acquiring their gum. But then we'll add in things, okay, now the government is going to come in and look at the unequal distribution of the bubble gum in the classroom. And from those who have a large number of pieces of gum, take some and then kind of redistribute that. So we kind of use candy in a way that can give students a tangible example, not just definitions. And that example sticks with them because, they might not go in depth if economic systems aren't their passion, but they can think back oh, we did that game with the gum, and right. Here's what happened in the different circumstances.
Mm-hmm. So to take it out of the abstract.
Correct.
Yeah. Lily, before you started taking AP Economics with Miss Money, Where did your information or ideas about economics come from?
Great question. I think a lot of my ideas also were kind of what Miss Money was talking about. Like the United States is associated with capitalism, and then other countries, like I've learned about the Russian Revolution in previous history classes, like Russia and North Korea and China are associated more with the socialist side. And I feel like I didn't have that much information about how capitalism actually worked. Like in my head, it was more just, free market and kind of the idea of like larger monopolies, because I myself and then a lot of other students, like we learn about the big like JP Morgan monopolies, and that's our idea of capitalism. But then once we came to Miss Money's class, I think a lot of people realized there's a lot more to it. And like the United States lives in more of a mixed economy, and it's not just a completely free market, which I think myself and others didn't fully understand before taking a economics course.
I would agree there, to seeing like what students learn about in the history classes with the examples of JP Morgan, those captains of industry, or robber barons, depending on how you look at them and look at their contributions to the economy. They get those concrete historic examples of what the past has looked like, but then in economics we more so explore consequences of different policies, or we look at the reality is it's not a complete free market. There's still laws in the government that can influence different aspects of our economy, whether we look at tax laws, we look at trade regulations, things like that. So I think when students enter economics, they have the historical background because economics is an upperclassman course. But we go down to kind of the fundamentals. Like, let's just look at a graph that's explaining this to us and like break down what does that do in the market, as well as let's talk about some of the consequences of these policies or motivations behind the policies.
In earlier grades also, we've learned a lot about just the law of like supply and demand. And so I feel like I came into the course with the knowledge of like if demand is high, prices are going to go up, but there's a lot more to it that we explore in Miss Money's classes with the more advanced graphs and just more knowledge about how those laws of economics actually work.
Was there anything that you were seeing, Lily, maybe through social media, about some of these economics concepts, elements of these systems, that now that you've had this class with Miss Money, and you're not done yet, but now that you've had this class, that you recognize as being not quite right, or maybe missing some things that are really important?
Yeah, one thing that I feel like a lot of people my age see in the media in relation to economics is information about tariffs. Like, tariffs are talked about a lot, and in Miss Money's class we learn more the objective facts about what a tariff does, like why a country might employ one. And I feel like in the media, people tend to form their opinion about a tariff based on a political ideology or just not fully understanding what it was. Like, for example, I didn't completely understand what a tariff actually meant. I would just see it in the media as this is something that the United States, Europe, and other countries are placing onto their trade regulations. But then in economics, we've learned more how that is something you can do to control trade, but there are lots of other options and just how it can affect the trade balances of different countries.
There's also something that you do with your students, Rachel, is with playing with Monopoly. Not gum this time, but with Monopoly. But the rules are a little bit different. What are the instructions for that game?
Yes, so the game that you're referencing, I have played when I taught a sociology class. And at that time, we were learning about social stratification. And with that version of Monopoly, the game board looked very similar to normal Monopoly. They still had Monopoly money. The basic principles were the same. You needed to acquire properties. Every time you passed go, you got income. However, in this version, different students were assigned different incomes. It was random. So I had all students choose a number, and they didn't know what the number was going to be for. And then I said, if you chose number 1, here's the income you start with, and we'll collect every time. So I had some students who were making several times the amount of other students. And so as the game went on, students kind of started to understand the impacts that different socioeconomic classes could have. these students who had the very high income found the game quite easy. They were able to acquire property. They never had to worry about landing on someone else's space. The game was easy for them. My students who received the lowest income started to cry out that the game was unfair, that this was not fair because they could not possibly keep up. They had no way of getting ahead or no way of thinking about even being able to buy one property, much less multiple. And so with that game, it evoked a lot of emotions in my classroom, but afterwards we had a conversation, this was a game of Monopoly where the rules were changed. But how do we see that playing out in our world? How do we see different incomes impacting opportunities, especially as we look at access to, education, but then that can have spiraling effects later on depending on what access looks like for different individuals.
Something I think that is important to point out here is that, on their own and as a whole, the West St. Louis County communities where most of your students, Rachel, live, these communities enjoy high levels of median income. And so, for instance, the U.S. Census Bureau figures from 2020 to 2024 show that the median household income of Baldwin, which is where Parkway West High School is located, was close to $125,000. Chesterfield's median was about $133,000. Manchester's was almost $98,000, while Town and Country came in with the highest median household income, and that was at $232,000. So as we've talked about Monopoly and some of the ways that students responded, to what extent do such differences come up in your classes insofar as socioeconomics are concerned?
So with my AP Economics course, we had a unit that focused on government policies and government intervention. We did this unit last December, and one of the principles of that unit, or the graphs that we learned, looked at distribution of wealth and income inequality within nations. And so for that conversation, we largely did talk about it at the nation level. So looking across a country, how large is the change in the distribution of wealth, what percent of households own most of the wealth compared to, is it proportional, right? Do 20% of households own 20% of the wealth? And what we learned in that unit is that's not the case. We have an unequal distribution of wealth. And the thing we mostly talked about in that unit then, after we looked at the graph, was how can nations fix this? How can nations try and address? And so I think that conversation becomes one where students can look at the country as a whole, acknowledging that the reality of every person in the country does not match the reality in which they currently live. But then what kinds of policies can increase access to opportunities throughout life that can help address income inequality? And so we talked a lot about progressive tax systems and how progressive tax systems can be used to help fund programs for those in lower income brackets. We also talk about just how to ensure opportunities and more equal access to those opportunities by providing access to education, whether we're talking about at the preschool level or after high school in a college level or a community college, helping people get access to those to provide them with educational services that can help them throughout their life.
Mm-hmm. We're talking with Parkway West High School teacher Rachel Money and Parkway senior Lily Overmann, who's a student in Rachel's AP Economics class. Rachel has made it a point to bring current events into her classroom and to have her students partake in exercises that help them better understand the real-life effects of economic policy. We need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from Gemma, architects, planners, and designers seeking to bring joy to their clients and communities. Details at gemastl.com.
Welcome back. Let's return to our conversation with Parkway West High School history teacher Rachel Money and Lily Overmann, a senior at Parkway West. Now, before the break, we were discussing how students in your AP classes, Rachel, have engaged with one another about capitalism and other economic systems and about government. Lily, the midterm elections are this year, and are you 18 yet?
Yes, I am 18.
Okay. So given what you have gleaned from the class that you've taken with Miss Money, all the things that you've talked about with your friends, the things that you've seen, whether it's in news media or social media and other places, do you feel like you are now, better equipped to make decisions that really do marry economics and government? Like, these two classes are separate, but they work together. Do you feel more prepared?
Yes, I think I do feel more prepared because I think listening to candidates, it's really easy for a candidate to claim they want to decrease inflation or their goals, but I think having the knowledge from AP government and AP economics, I kind of understand more what they are talking about and how in reality it will actually work, so that can give me more of a sense of, is what they're saying possible? And I think without the knowledge that I've learned from AP economics and AP government, I might not know what policy would support my own beliefs and what change that I want to see. So I definitely think having that information allows me to understand what candidates are pursuing policies that will give me the change that I want to see.
Mm-hmm. And ultimately, Rachel, is that your goal, is to equip young people to make informed decisions?
Yes, I believe that, citizens, we should be active in our government. Our voice should be heard. And so when I hear students say, I understand how I can interact with my government, I understand how I can make a difference, that's ultimately what I want. I want them to understand the role that they can play and the power that their voice has. And I hope that students leave my class with the skills to not only understand our world, but also to understand how to sift through all the information we're presented. We are just bombarded with information daily, and it can be a lot. And, there's a lot of information from a lot of different sources. And so teaching students not only content, but also skills needed to understand, to process, and to assess that information is really important to me.
Mm-hmm. You've been working with students now for how many years?
This is my fifth year.
The fifth year. We've had conversations about media literacy and young people in particular and their degree of engagement with issues, with the news, their capacity to tell the difference between what's legit and what is not. Is there anything you can share about what your students have shown you that demonstrates that they're actually much readier than some more pessimistic people might think?
Yeah, I think one thing about my students that really speaks to, how ready they are is I can tell a lot of my students care. They see these issues and they will come to me in class and be like, I saw this in the news, but maybe this isn't something I fully understand, or I'm having trouble processing. Can we talk about it? And oftentimes, it's related to something we're discussing in class. If it's my government students, it's related to actions of the president, of Congress, or even state governments. And they're seeing things happen and they want to know more. They want to understand so that they can properly assess the issue. And so the best example I can think of is right when the government was preparing to shut down. So it hadn't happened yet, but we were in the last couple of days. It happened to be the day I was teaching the budget in class, so that class hadn't gotten the lesson yet, and we didn't talk about shutdowns yet. I had a student walk into class and was like, Ms. Money, I saw something online. It said the government's going to shut down, but I don't even know what that means. And does that mean we won't have a government? Or what's going to happen? And it was a moment where the student allowed themselves to be vulnerable and to admit they didn't fully understand, but they wanted to because they wanted to understand what that meant for our country. And so I think students, because of the world we live in, because media surrounds us, they don't struggle to see information, but the fact that students today are willing to sit with it, to process it, and still ask questions instead of just accepting it as fact is really something notable.
Mm-hmm. I've also noticed that in classes, sometimes people will be talking about something they saw in the news, but people are always really, they're very specific to say where they got the information from, and they'll even say, like, I'm not sure if this is true. Like, I heard this on whatever website or even, like, a social media outlet like TikTok, and they'll admit that, and they're saying, like, I heard it here, so it might not be true, but they do want to learn more and make sure their source is credible.
And those situations, I think, make really great classroom learning moments, because the reality is students today are on TikTok all the time. And so it makes sense that's where they run into information. But then from there, I can say, okay, well, here's how we find articles. Here's how we find sources that maybe we feel a little more comfortable believing that might be reliable, that aren't just some random TikTok account on your For You page. And so it becomes a situation where I can teach them how to deal with that. You saw something, you don't know if it's credible, let's learn to evaluate it.
Mm-hmm. Adults need to learn that too. They're running into TikTok, and TikTok is definitely crashing into them as well. One thing I want to make sure that we get to, the capacity to have a conversation with someone with whom you have different life experiences, different opinions. How has that happened in the class that you've been in, Lily?
I think people today are, at least in my class, are careful to be respectful of other people's opinions. So I haven't really seen any large, like, disagreements, but people will say their opinion, where they're coming from, and sometimes people will disagree. Like, for example, like, some people, when we talked about, like, welfare policies, and that was just with, like, increasing or decreasing government spending, some people think that the government should be spending more than others, and people say, like, why they believe that, but I think people are pretty respectful of each other's opinions and where they're coming from, especially in our class.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think in my classroom, like, my first rule is this is a safe environment for all of us. And we are going to have protocols, especially if I am facilitating a class discussion. We have protocols in place that need to be followed. You are able to have your own opinion. But when we are sharing those opinions, we are going to back it up with the facts that support us. We're going to have evidence. And if you want to disagree with someone, that is also all right. But there is going to be disagreement with respect. We are going to have civil discourse. So my class recently, with my government course, we are doing an activity with the bureaucracy, and they all learned a different department. So we were just focusing on the cabinet departments that day. And the simulation was that Congress was planning on cutting from the cabinet department budgets, and they had to defend their department that they were randomly assigned, as well as, after everyone presented, either defend other departments or propose the cuts come from other departments. And with this, a lot of current events were woven into the conversation, and a lot of students felt very passionately. And some of the departments in which I saw a lot of disagreement among students were the Defense Department as well as Homeland Security. And so we had a lot of discussions in class. Students referenced articles, they referenced statistics that they went and found to help strengthen their argument. And ultimately, like, students, there's often concessions like, I understand that you want to make sure we have a military, but if we look at the budget, here's what I think we could do to address how much, for example, the Defense Department was spending. And so just seeing how that simulation played out, I had students with a lot of different beliefs in the classroom and a lot of very passionate beliefs. But they found ways to explain their opinions to help others learn. And they also took a moment to listen and try and understand their peers instead of just trying to force their opinion elsewhere.
Lily, is there an example of something that you've taken away from Miss Money's class? Not the textbook stuff necessarily, but what you've learned through the experience of being in the class so far, that you can see, it has changed a perspective that you held before, or maybe where you have been able to help someone see things in another light?
Yes, I think one thing I've definitely taken away from her class is that even though we have a lot of textbook definitions of what is supposed to happen economically in real life, a lot of times like the models that we create are simplified and it's not what's actually happening. And I think that's just important to understand, like when we apply things to the real world, and just in general, like when we go into the real world, we might create like an idea for a policy that we think should work a certain way, but different factors make it so it's not going to work that way. And I just think it's taught me to have more of an open mind and understand, like, even if something is supposed to happen, it's not necessarily going to happen the exact textbook way that we learn.
Mm-hmm. As we close here, after 5 years of teaching, Rachel, have you had students come back and tell you, either come back or reach out to you to say, this thing that we talked about, maybe it's a topic, a concern that we talked about in your class is now something that I'm working on, or that I've put some time and energy into improving?
So in the past 5 years, I have been lucky. I have heard from students who have graduated and they've kept in touch. And I've had some students who come back with the most extraordinary stories, or it's even something as simple as maybe it's not related to their degree and what they're pursuing, but they saw a protest about something they cared about, and they decided to exercise their voice and join and advocate for change. Or they took a moment to help someone else understand something. I have a student, he was one of my first economics students, and he came back to me and he's like, hey, I'm helping students in economics now because of, what I learned in your class. I'm able to kind of, move that and help someone else. And so even if it's not necessarily change related to policy, I have heard stories from my former students where they've taken my learning and been able to either help someone or apply it to issues they find important.
Rachel Money is a social studies teacher at Parkway West High School, and Lily Overmann is a Parkway West High School senior. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
This episode was produced by Emily Woodbury.
Edited by Lila Holobashich.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Hi, I'm Laura Hamden, and my colleague Jessica Rogan and I are your daily hosts of the Gateway newsletter. We meet with the editors in the STLPR newsroom every weekday to bring you the top local stories of the day in a quick and easy 6-minute read by 6 a.m. In an age of overwhelm, it's a refreshing, thoughtful take on the news day, if we do say so ourselves. Fine-tune your daily news habit with the Gateway newsletter. Subscribe at stlpr.org/gateway.